Well, it is working. It is working. Can you hear me? I might just end up shouting. Okay. Hello. Welcome, everybody, especially during the Easter break. It's very nice to see so many people here. I'm delighted to welcome Professor Tim Ingold here today to give his lecture entitled What on Earth is the Ground? Tim is Emeritus Professor of Social Anthropology at the University of Aberdeen and a Fellow of the British Academy and of the Royal Society of Edinburgh. Besides his distinguished work in the field of social anthropology, Professor Ingold has explored the links between environmental perception and skilled practice and is well known to creative practitioners, I'm sure most of you, for his books including The Perception of the Environment, Being Alive, and Making Anthropology, Art and Architecture. His argument that we think through processes of making and that we learn through doing is always boldly and lucidly expressed in his books and lively talks. That these processes undergo continuous change are clearly of pertinence to us at the University of the Arts, and perhaps never more so as we face new challenges for education and creative practice today. Tim's lecture today launches Approaching Estate, a 3-day event organised by the sensingsite research group here at Central St Martin's and hosted by Furtherfield Commons. The event will bring together a range of artistic, interdisciplinary and collaborative practices which inquire into experimental methodologies of site, landscape and place. The interlinking presentations, performances, films and discussion aim to expand the conventional definition of estate and explore how new directions for critical practice can arise from shared exchange. So, before we begin, the exits, as most of you know, are here at the bar and my buzzer, please. So, without further ado.
Thank you very much. Well, thank you very much, Susan, and thank you all for coming in your Easter holidays. I'm very impressed in this magnificent building. I've been wondering what the ground is. What on earth is the ground? Well, it's a surface, says the dictionary, on which things or persons stand or move. But then, what kind of surface is it? Does it have one side or two? Does it cover the earth, or does it cover it up? Can you roll it, fold it? Can you cut it, or make holes in it? And what lies above, and what beneath? Indeed, the ground, this surface which we so often take for granted as the foundations for everything else, turns out to be thoroughly elusive. And what I want to do today is to have a go, and this is still very preliminary, I'm still working this stuff out. I want to have a go at figuring out what on earth the ground actually is. And we could perhaps start from the proposition that wherever there is ground, 3 things must be present. Firstly, there must be earth. Secondly, there must be air or atmosphere or weather or whatever you want to call it. And then thirdly, there must be things living, growing, moving around, what we call inhabitants. So perhaps we should start from the proposition that the ground is a coming together of these 3 things: earth, atmosphere, and inhabitants. But then the question arises, how do they both bear upon and suffer under one another? And in thinking this through, what came to mind was an ancient children's game. I'm sure you've all played it at one time or another. It's the game scissors, paper, stone. You know the one? That's stone, that's scissors, that's paper. Scissors cuts paper, paper wraps stone, stone blunts scissors. So the beautiful thing about this game is that not one of those three elements, scissors, paper, stone, is all-powerful. Each can alternately be agent or patient, can be on top or underneath, can be in charge, can be vanquished. So their agency and their patiency, what they do and what is done to them, are wrapped up in the cycle. Now, it occurred to me that we could set out some substitutions. Let the paper be earth. Let the stone be weather. And let the scissors be inhabitants. Okay, again, we've got these three elements. Paper, scissors, stone. Now it's earth, inhabitants, weather. What happens? Well, inhabitants, people, animals, whatever it might be, as they move around or grow, they inscribe marks of one sort and another. Marks, paths, or trails in the earth. Plants send out roots, snails send out little slime trails, people lay out paths. All these things that are growing are sending out their trails. They're either incising marks in the land, or they're making trails through it. So, inhabitants trump the earth. The earth, for its part, is continually racked by massive geomorphological forces which causes the earth to bend, to buckle, to crack, to fold. These are the geomorphological forces that actually create the shapes of the earth as we find it. And then the weather, with its winds, its storms, and its rainfall, erodes the surface of the earth, wiping out the tracks of the inhabitants. So, inhabitants trump the earth in a process of inscription. The earth trumps the weather in a process that I'll call eruption. The weather trumps the inhabitants and their lines in a process that we would call erosion. So with the ground, it seemed to me, we're dealing with a cycle of inscription, eruption, and erosion. Each of these is a different kind of process. None is all-powerful, but all of them partake in the ongoing formation of the ground. So let's have a closer look at each of these three processes: inscription, eruption, and erosion. Inscription tends to go along like, as Paul Klee famously put it, like taking a line for a walk. So I happen to have a pencil in my hand, and I'm just walking along, and pencil makes, and I walk off again. That line I just made was a trace of my movement as I was going along. It doesn't really begin anywhere. It doesn't really end anywhere. It's just at a particular moment, well, my pencil made contact with the paper and then it came off again. I've ended up with a rather nice little curve. And so this line, it doesn't go from A to B, just carries on as indeed life does. It just goes on and makes a trail as it goes. Now, with eruption, it's a bit different, because there you've got forces that fold or crack or crease a surface, these movements are intrinsic to the surface itself. It may be that something like a fold arises over time, but it does so simultaneously along its entire length. I mean, in this case, I've moved along. So I've gone along from one end to the other. But if I fold, let's suppose I take this piece of paper and with these forces of my hand here, I'm compressing them together, and there I've got a fold. And that fold emerges, although it takes time to fold it, the fold itself emerges simultaneously along its entire length. It's not a going along movement, it's a creasing a creasing movement. Now, if you then turn to erosion, erosion is quite unlike both inscription and eruption. With line making, as I mentioned, the movement is drawn to a focus at the point. So when I make a line, I've got the pencil point here, and there it touches the paper and carries on. But with erosion, the movement is distributed across a surface. It's actually just like rubbing out, okay? So when I'm going to rub this line out, what do? My hand is going like this. The word we use is to wipe, and it comes from ancient Old English wipjan, which means an oscillating movement, wiping. It's backwards and forwards. So this is a movement that is not in any sense contained within a line, but always overflows it. So it's a movement, the movement of erosion is one that covers a surface without ever delimiting it. It always exceeds whatever limits you can impose. Now I began to think, what happens if we put these three movements together? So I'll begin with inscription and erosion. And I want to make a comparison with writing with ink on parchment, as people used to do regularly in medieval times before the development of the printing press. Parchment is a highly absorbent material, so when you write on it, the ink tends to sink quite deep in. It was also, at the time, a very expensive material, so that people tended to want to use the same pieces of parchment over and over again, if they possibly could, rather than producing new sheets. So when you wanted to reuse a sheet of parchment that had already been written on, you had to take a penknife and scrape it. And you scrape and scrape and scrape until you got as much as possible as you can of the old inscription off, so you can then write again. But it's impossible to get it all off, however hard you try, because the ink sinks so deep in. So that there's some traces of old writing always showing through when you're still trying to write the new writing, so to speak, on top. And that leads to what paleographers call the palimpsest. It's a much-used term. It's been picked up particularly by archaeologists who tend to think of an archaeological site as a palimpsest in which the land has been written on over and over again by different people doing different things in different projects, producing multiple traces. And apparently, one on top of the other. But actually, this isn't what happens. And I found this really tricky to work out, and I ended up doing lots of diagrams in my notebook, which I'm going to try and imitate here. But suppose then that at a particular time, let's call it T0, this is a cross-section of a parchment, right? So here's the surface of your parchment, and then you're going to write some lines in it. And remember that when you write with the pen, the ink is sinking deep down. So I'm going to suppose that there's a line that you've drawn here. So this is the surface of the parchment. This is the cross-section of your line. Can you see that all right? And so this is all inky, right? So this is a cross-section of the parchment. Now we'll put in another line, same thing, and then we'll put in another line, same one like that. So now we've got the cross-section of the parchment with 3 lines in it. Now we want to use this parchment again. So we take our penknife and we scrape down to a particular level. So we got it down to this level here. This is now T1. And we start writing again. So we make some more lines. Again, the ink sinks right in. And then we'll do it again. So we'll rub out these ones. And here we are at time T2. And we'll draw some new lines. Now, if you can see anything from this mess, and let's try and rub out as much as I can of what's on top. This is now at time T2. Actually, I've got a better rubber here somewhere where I put it. What have we got? The extraordinary thing, and it took me a long time to work this out, is that the oldest marks have risen up to the surface. The newest marks have gone down. So in the palimpsest, far from putting one layer of inscription on top of another, as though they were on successive acetate sheets, and you were putting one above the other, and you could somehow see through the past one on the top, what's happening is that the past is rising up even as the present sinks down. And I call that, so it's not a stratigraphic, the palimpsest is not stratigraphic at all. It's not a matter of layering one on top of the other. It's in fact just the opposite. It rests on a principle that I call AntiStratigraphic. It's an AntiStratigraphic principle in which as you inscribe the present deep down, the past rises further and further up. And actually, it's not difficult to imagine this. If you're an archaeologist, for example, surveying a landscape, and you're interested in detecting ancient pathways, and you have a trained eye, and you'd look at a field, for example, and see, yes, you can just make out the last remaining features of an old path there, and then very soon, with the weather and everything, that's going to wear away, we won't see it anymore. But you can just make that out just on the surface. Whereas the marks that have been made by more recent activity are very clear and very deeply incised into the landscape itself. And this is fairly obvious, but difficult to think through. So what works for the parchment, for the palimpsest, it works also for tracks in the ground. The oldest tracks are just visible traces on the surface while about to disappear. So with the anti-stratigraphic principle, it's not, you don't get a layering of the present over the past, but rather the past rising up even as the present sinks down. So anti-stratigraphy is not a layering, but a turning over. And keep that in mind, because I'll return to it. But that was talking about inscription and erasure there. And now I want to bring in the third movement, and that is the movement of eruption. Because I want to argue that the palimpsest is what we could call a deep surface. It's a surface that is formed where the ground's rising up, that is, its eruption, meets the atmosphere or the weather's beating down, that is, in erosion. So that the ground is not exactly an interface between the earth and the atmosphere at all. Here we come to the problem of the definition of an interface, but according to philosophers, an interface is something that both comes in between one domain and another, but also allows a passage across that boundary between them. So if when you're working on a keyboard, you might, or a smartphone or something, and the designers will say, well, that's an interface. On the one side is you, with your thinking and your fingers and everything. On the other side is some stuff that's going on inside the computer. You are definitely on one side, the computer's on the other, but the keys allow some sort of transmission across this boundary between the two. Or any kind of button on a machine that you press, again, is something that allows information to travel across from one side of the interface to the other. So if one thinks about an interface, it looks something like this, that here it is, it's got one side and another side, and information can travel, in some sense, across from one side to the other. If you have a button here or a key, it enables the transmission to take place across that boundary. But when we think about the ground, it's not quite like that. Because really, I think the ground is not so much an interface between one, say, air on one side and earth on the other, as a zone in which air and earth actually interpenetrate one another. So rather than drawing it like this, say, okay, there's the ground, we would draw it like this. So here is the atmosphere. Here is the earth. The atmosphere is bearing down, the earth is erupting up, and here is a zone of interpenetration. And it's that zone where earth and atmosphere meet and interpenetrate that we could call the ground. An interesting thing about that, then, is that there's no edge to it. You can't exactly say as you go up, where does the ground come to an end? Have we left the ground yet? Or how deep down have we left the atmosphere? Because they're meeting there, and they're not bounded in either of these two directions. So you could compare this sort of diagram with an interface diagram, which would set it like this. This will be the atmosphere. This will be the earth. If you thought of the ground as an interface, oh, sorry, that's gone off there. Then you'd say, okay, there's something like that. But it's not like that. It's like that. if you can follow my reasoning. And one clue to this, at least in the English language, this doesn't interestingly work in French, but in the English language, it lies in the double meaning of our word to wear. To wear, as we say we wear clothes, but we also say that our faces are worn by the weather, that a surface is worn by use. So wear has this double sense of putting something on, but also of wear and tear, of erosion in use. Now, if we took a stratigraphic logic, if we thought of everything in terms of layering, then putting on and wearing away would be completely contradictory. You can't do one and the other at the same time. Either you're putting your clothes on or you're taking your clothes off, but you can't be doing both at once. But with the principle of the palimpsest, or the deep surface, these two kinds of wearing are actually one and the same, because it is in the process of erosion that the depth comes to the surface, as we saw in the case of the palimpsest. As the surface wears, so the depth comes up. And this is a surface that covers, but it doesn't cover up. If you were to think of a Renaissance statue, for example, carved out of marble, and maybe the sculptor has produced a beautiful figure with flowing robes and a costume where you could almost feel the velvety silk of the costume, but it's really just stone. But we don't think when we see that the stone is covering anything up. We see the stone as like a velvet costume, but we don't start trying to strip the figure and imagining the body underneath. So the stone, the surface of the stone covers the statue, but it doesn't cover the statue up. Long ago, John Ruskin described the ground in exactly these terms and said that we should think of the ground as a veil. Not in the sense of something that you can partially see through, but more in the sense of a covering that does not cover up. Now, the idea that the past rises up as the present sinks down in a kind of turning movement brings me to another word, which is very interesting, and that word is volume. I looked it up recently because I was sort of tantalized by this word and where it came from. And I found that the original meaning of the volume was a scroll, a written scroll, such as was used in the days before the development of the codex of medieval times or the printed book of today. The scroll, of course, would be rolled up and unrolled. And So rolling up is revolution, unrolling is evolution, because the word volume comes from the Latin volvere, meaning to turn or to roll. So you roll up, that's the revolution. You roll out, that's the evolution. So that's the original Latin derivation. So you're rolling and unrolling as you would with say, a carpet. Now, the interesting thing is that when you roll up a carpet, it's, and you could try this at home, its lower and upper regions are inverted. We say up and over. So as you're rolling up the carpet, what was underneath, the underside of the carpet comes over and rolls on top. So there's this rolling over movement. Now, historically, in the Western world, the scroll eventually gave way to what scholars call the codex, a codex being a manuscript parchment book. But in the codex, every page is effectively a fold. And you go from page to page by turning. The medieval book was always open on a desk or in a scholar's hands. So if one drew a cross-section of it, it would be something like okay, these aren't very realistic pages, but imagine somehow that this is a book with 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 5 pages. It's open like that, and each of these effectively is a fold. Now, as you go from page to page, you have to turn. So turn the page so that what was above goes to below. So continually turning. So you move like this. So what was originally the unrolling of the scroll becomes a turn like that in a book, a codex that is actually folded, and in that, and as you turn the page, what was under becomes over, what was over goes under, recto becomes verso, verso becomes recto. But the key thing is you cannot go through the page. The page is not actually an interface. It's not something that you have, here's one side, and you go through and you, by some sort of key, you can get to the other side of the page. Rather, the page of the codex, we could say, is Janus-faced. Like, you know, the mythical god Janus, who has two faces, each face facing in opposite directions. But what you can't do is go through Janus from one face through back to the other one. Like if you fired a bullet through, and you can't actually do that. So Janus is this rather interesting thing where you have two surfaces facing outwards in opposite directions, but there's no in between. I mean, that's sort of a no-go area. But eventually, with the printed book, we begin to get and with the printed books, they were usually not open but closed on the shelf between covers. And with the printed book, the pages are layered to form a stack. So instead of this, we begin to get that sort of structure that we're used to today. So the volume, what was still called a volume, is actually now a stratified entity, and as you go through, you work down the stack. So that the volume is now comparable not to a rolled up surface, but to a box or a container to be filled with contents. So now we have a printed book, we open it, and it says, here are the contents. And the book is like this box, and we think of a volume nowadays, as we usually do, as a three-dimensional volume. As you say, has X, Y, and Z dimensions, we can calculate how much space there is inside. So the meaning of volume has completely changed from the original one being a scroll to the present day as a measurable box. Well, now, let's return from thinking about books and codexes and scrolls to the ground. And you could reasonably object to my argument so far that, well, you can't exactly roll up the ground like a carpet. And unless you happen to be, one of these gardening firms or somebody, who's relaying your lawn. They come in with bits of lawn that they just roll out. But on the whole, you can't roll the ground up. But you can turn it. And of course, turning the ground is absolutely key to at least traditional agricultural practices. You would turn the land, and you would talk about the turn of the seasons. And the turn of the seasons were marked by the key steps in the agricultural cycle of ploughing, sowing, and harvesting. So that gives us actually the names of our months, and it describes the turn of the seasons in the agricultural year that rolls over and over and over again. So in the turn of the seasons, in thinking about time in that kind of way, as a revolutionary movement, not in a Marxist sense, but in this sort of more etymological sense, think of time as a revolutionary movement, then old memories rise up to the surface so that you can engage with them directly. This again corresponds with reading practices of medieval times, when people would say that you wouldn't think about books as constituting an archive. You wouldn't go to books in order to discover old facts from way back. You go to books as an instrument of memory, and the point of the book was to bring people who lived in the past up into the present so that you could have them right in front of you and engage with them. So people spoke about the voices of the pages. When you read a book, the book would actually speak to you as though the personages whose deeds are described were there. So again, there's this idea of turning and bringing old memories up into the present, not of digging down. So it's the opposite principle to the principle of the archive, which is where you dig down to find things. But once we think of the volume as a box or a container with stratified contents, then time cuts orthogonally through the strata. So once we're thinking about the volume like this, then we start thinking of time as a movement that runs down. So if we want to go into the past, we go down. If we want to go up to the present, we go up. And that, of course, leads to the dichotomy that we're all familiar with between synchrony and diachrony. The synchrony referring to the presentness of an existing layer, diachrony to the succession of layers, and they're set at right angles to each other. That dichotomy, of course, goes back to the famous course on linguistics delivered by Ferdinand de Saussure at the turn of the 20th century. So with a stratified view, to reach the past, like an archaeologist, you have to dig down. That is, you have to excavate. I mean, that's what archaeologists do. And it also means that renewal doesn't mean turning the ground, as in the agricultural cycle. I mean, the farmer is turning the soil every year in order to renew it, to bring fertile soil back up to the surface. So renewal is, if you're a farmer ploughing the land, renewal depends on that turning movement. But if you're thinking stratigraphically, then renewal means adding a new layer, one upon the other, to form a stack. If you want to renew anything, you simply have to bulldoze what's there and put another layer on top. And many planners, when they're talking about urban renewal, will immediately think of that. Okay, let's bulldoze what's there and build something like this on top, rather than renew by, let's say, what's under there, and let's see what we can bring up. So we could perhaps say that the ground of turning is soft, and that the ground of layering is hard. So the soft ground is absorbent. The hard ground, like parchment, for example, or soil, the hard ground is non-absorbent. And to get at the contrast, you could compare footprints and stamps. And the interesting thing about footprints, human footprints, maybe animal footprints too, the interesting thing about them is that they can really only be made in soft surfaces, like sand, or snow, or moss, or wet mud. If the surface is too hard, like, say, concrete, or paving stones, or even solid rock, there's no way you can make a footprint, or it's very, very hard to do so, because It just, the ground just doesn't give enough to take the impression of your foot. But just for the very same reason that footprints are made in soft ground, they are readily eroded by the weather. They don't last very long because they're susceptible to wind and rainfall, snow melt, and so on. So footprints are ephemeral. They exist for a certain length of time. They are held, in a sense, within the seasonal round. And in that sense, footprints are anti-stratigraphic. But stamps are stratigraphic. By the stamp, I mean when on a hard surface you have something that's formed with a pattern and you just press it down. That obviously is what happens in the printing press, where the pattern is already set as type in the galley and comes right down with a press upon the paper surface. But you can also stamp the ground in all kinds of ways in printing your mark on it. So the stamp, which is imposed from above, is stratigraphic. So you could say that we stamp the pavement, the hard pavement, but we make our footprints in the soft earth. So we then end up with a sort of dichotomy or distinction between hard paving and soft earth. And I want to look at that just for a moment. I mean, in an urban environment like we are here in the middle of London, most of the time you're walking on pavements or roads. And somewhere underneath, you know that there's some earth, but you don't actually come into contact with it, because on top of the earth, let's say it's a pavement. Here, again, the cross-section, we've got some sorts of urban soils underneath. Sorry, I have to bring this down. But here is paving, and here's the air on top. So that, in that sense, with paving stones, a piece of pavement, like a paving stone or maybe a block of asphalt or concrete, it does have upper and lower sides, and it does separate the atmosphere from the earth. Indeed, that was the whole purpose in the particularly in the 18th and 19th centuries, the whole purpose of paving the streets. Well, it had two purposes. One purpose was to make it easier for transport, for wheeled vehicles to move about freely. The other purpose was to improve public health, because people were worried at the time that all kinds of noxious fumes, which caused ill health, were rising up from the earth. And what you had to do was to cover the earth up so that those fumes wouldn't get through, and then people would lead healthier lives, because the air that they breathed would be the open air, not polluted by these fumes that were coming up from the earth. This was a very widely held theory in the 18th and 19th century. So the whole idea of paving was to put a lid on the earth, and that lid has an upper side and a downside. It is actually an interface of a sort, because there are manholes in it where people can get through and deal with infrastructural problems down below, like fatbergs and things like that. So this pavement really is an interface, and it has a certain depth, however many centimeters or meters it might be. You could measure it, and you could argue that the pavement offers a sort of conditional support depending on the strength and load-bearing capacity of its materials. If you put too much weight on it, you could go through. I mean, it's the same sort of principle with ice on a lake. You know, that depending on the thickness of the ice, it will may or may not carry the weight of a human being or a vehicle. And if you go out when the ice is too thin, you might break through with disastrous consequences. So in that sense, there's a sense of the surface as an interface. In the case of ice, it's between air and on top and water underneath, that it has a measured depth, and its load-bearing is conditional. But if you were to take the bare earth, here's some bare earth, just like the page of the Codex, the bare earth has only one side, this side here. It is open to the atmosphere. It rises up, coming out in all sort of outcrops and vegetation and so on. The most beautiful, I don't have it with me, but the most beautiful illustration of this is that some of the drawings of Van Gogh showing fields and crops and the air absolutely full of seeds and pollen that's rising up. So you just have this feeling that there's this ground that is in no sense a uniform blocking surface, but something that is literally exploding into the atmosphere all the time, rising up and giving way into it. It's not something that you could ever draw a clear. You can't really say where it ends and where the earth ends and the air begins. So it's rising up and emptying out, but also the depth of the earth is not a measurable depth. It is actually immeasurable, but it's a depth that you feel on the surface. If somebody said, you're standing on a muddy patch, and somebody says, okay, how deep? How deep is this ground? You say, it makes no sense, because if we go back to this picture here, here's the ground. You see, you can go as deep as you like. There's no end to it. So the Earth has an immeasurable depth, but the support it offers is unconditional. As long as we think that Earth is what we're standing on, we think that it will support us whatever happens. We might trip over. There might be pits in the Earth that we could fall into and have to pick ourselves up, but there are no holes in it. We can't fall through the Earth when it's a soft surface of that kind. So you can fall on or into the Earth, but you cannot fall through it. It can have pits, but it can't have gaps or holes in it. So then, that leads to the question, is the Earth, such as I've tried to describe it here, is it open or closed? Is it an open surface like this, or is it a closed surface like that? And I thought, well, perhaps, in some sense, it is both. Perhaps there's a continual double movement, which we could say, on the one hand, of exposure, in which the Earth is opened up to the air, and on the other hand, of encrustation, in which it is closed off. I mean, imagine, for an Earth-forming process, take something like a volcanic lava flow. Whilst it's steaming along from the volcano, it's open to the air, there are all sorts of gases and things coming out, but as it cools, the lava forms a solid crust, and then it seems to close down. And it occurred to me then that this double movement of exposure and encrustation is of the essence of burial. Burial is something very special and maybe peculiar to humans, in that nobody quite knows where the word human comes from, but Giambattista Vico, in his New Science in the 18th century, reckoned that it came from the Latin humando, which means to bury. That the real thing about humans is burial, and the kind of sense of relation to the earth that burial delivers. So now, let's suppose that we have a body to bury. So the first thing we do is we open the earth. We dig a grave. So again, here is a cross section, and we have some soft earth, and we dig a pit. We don't make a hole. We can't make a hole in the earth. We just dig a pit. And then we take our body and we put in. There he is. Here's the body. Okay, so now we put the body in so that the body is sort of embraced by the earth. But then the next thing we do is we cover it over with a slab. So we take a slab of some sort of hard material, could be stone, and we cover that up. And there we put it on top. So there we have our burial. And so in this case, we could say, yes, indeed, the body is buried below the ground. The ground does have sort of an underneath. There's another side in relation to this slab. But then what happens over time, of course, over a very long period of time, let us say, is that gradually natural processes of soil formation, deposition, and so on, erosion carry on, and more soil forms on top here, and vegetation grows over, and so on. And after a while, we might not know that there was any burial site there at all. And archaeologists spend a lot of time looking for these sites, and sometimes they're marked with a stone or something that gives them a clue that there might be a body buried underneath. But otherwise, you just look at a field, and it just looks like a field, and you wouldn't think there's anybody buried underneath there. So that eventually the burial site is quite indistinguishable from its surroundings until perhaps it is rediscovered through archaeological investigation. Now, it's quite interesting that camouflage, or at least some forms of camouflage, work on the same principle. And suppose that you're an army commander and you want to hide your tanks. You've got a whole lot of tanks, and the enemy is flying its planes overhead, sort of reconnaissance planes, and you need to hide your tanks so the enemy don't realize that you've got them there. So you devise some sort of sheet, some sort of tarpaulin, and you paint it sort of with streaks of green and brown and things like that, and then you put it all over the tanks. The point about the camouflage there is not simply that by putting the tarpaulin over the tanks, you've hidden the tanks, so they're not directly visible to the planes that are flying overhead. The point is that you've made it look, from the point of view of the plane, as though they were just looking at another patch of ground, just like any other patch of ground. So it's not about hiding the tanks, as people say, oh, there's a cover there, but we don't know what's underneath because we can't see. It's making it look like a soft ground, making it look like the open earth, like this. So it's not just that you can't see what's underneath, but there can't be anything underneath. There can't be anything than bare earth. So you're fooling the pilots in the aeroplanes. You're fooling them or deceiving them into taking one kind of surface for another. What is actually, the tarpaulin, is actually an interfacial surface with a top side and an underside in which you can go through, is being made to look as though it was a one-sided surface of the earth which has infinite depth. That's how that kind of camouflage works, so that you think that there is nothing underneath. Now, if you think that's a rather strange example, consider this, that currently, I believe, in Germany and also in Finland, and maybe other countries as well, there are plans to dispose of radioactive waste from nuclear power plants. And the idea is to bury it in old mine shafts. So you have some mine shafts that are there from old mine workings. You put your nuclear waste down at the bottom of these shafts, out of harm's way, apparently. Then you cover up the top of the shaft with a slab, just like the burial there. Then after a while, plants grow, trees grow, and some of the publicity material put out by the Finnish operation, they show what looks like pristine forest, with reindeer running around, the odd bear, and everything just looking as though nothing else, just virgin forest. But underneath is the radioactive waste. The question is that if there are different ways of thinking about memory, as I've suggested by comparing the scroll and the stack, or the palimpsest and the archive, so there are different ways of thinking about forgetting. And if I return to what I was saying about the process of erosion or wiping, the question that arises, looking at this, is what is the difference between erosion and burial as ways of forgetting? What's the difference between those two? Because both, in a sense, both erosion and burial are ways of forgetting, but with erosion, the surface of the ground is open. So with erosion, the ground is rising up and then being wiped away by the weather. But with burying, it's the opposite movement. Things are being put away down there. Of course, we have no idea what might be under there. We know what archaeologists have discovered, but there could be masses of other things under there that are completely forgotten, that had been buried at one stage or other. When those enormous tombs were discovered with the Chinese emperor in China, full of emperors and things like that, nobody knew they were there until by happenstance somebody came across some evidence and began to dig. So things can be, so to get back to the nuclear waste, you wonder, is it possible? Is it possible that 1,000 years from now, no one will know that there were mine shafts and nuclear waste below? Or is there something about the duplicity of presenting one thing and another that will always remain? Because at the moment, there are plenty of things buried under the earth that we have no knowledge of. So could it be the same, or might it not be in the future? But anyway, if then we combine these two movements of erosion with the ground rising up and being wiped out, and burying of closure. This is a movement of opening. This is a movement of closure. If we put the two together, what do we get? We get that very turning movement that I began with, the movement of combining opening and closure, eruption and encrustation. And that, I submit, perhaps is some sort of answer as to what the ground actually is. It's a sort of perpetual rolling over. And that's what I've got to say. I don't know how long I've taken, but we can have as long as you like to discuss this or ask questions. As I said, these are ideas that are still very much in formation, and so I'm very grateful for any ideas you might have to contribute to them. But I think it might help us to think about sites.
Well, I really enjoyed that and I hope you did. You took us on a great journey, actually. And it was incredibly rich. So there's I'm hoping there's lots of questions here. We thought we'd open it up to the floor. See what you'd all like to how you'd like to respond. Okay, I can start with a question, actually. Because what I really enjoyed, but I'm not sure how you would describe it, is the way you put into practice what you're talking in your mode of performance.
You mean in the drawing stuff?
Yeah. Particularly in this technological, highly technologized space.
Well, as I mentioned to you, I think earlier that I really hate slides. I mean, I was forced many years ago to do by my university to do a training course in how to do PowerPoint. And the only thing I wanted to learn was how to put up a picture if I needed to. They didn't teach me that. They taught me how to bring in bullet points from the left or the right. Or that. And I resolved then never ever to use PowerPoint ever. And I've more or less stuck to that, which means that I never have any technical problems unless I've lost my voice, which can happen. But I do think that if one is trying to argue, as I have been trying to argue, that that knowledge, that understanding is something that grows through, that is gathered, is brought together through a sort of movement, then to rely on a technology of projection in which the thing is already there, is simply sent onto a screen for surfing, is actually in blatant contradiction to what it's trying to say. And so what I have been trying to do is, and this is technologically advanced, I mean, I've been happy with just a blackboard and chalk, is to show that there are ways of talking, of writing, of performing, of doing art, or whatever it is that you're doing, which should be actually consistent with the philosophy that you're trying to persuade others, I suppose, to to adopt. And that, yeah, that's something. This particular kind of technology, though, is rather clever. I think it works. It works quite well, even though it involves projection, but it's fine.
Tim, that was a fantastic lecture. Thank you very much. I'm fascinated by your framing of this, I suppose, discourse around ground, and I think it offers a lot for us to understand landscape. I was wondering whether you've presented this work to geologists, first of all, and whether geologists have a response to some of the, claims that you're making. And I'm also wondering whether you could expand on this, I suppose, this idea that ground doesn't have a thickness. And I'm just thinking, just very practically, if you go to the mountains, you find some very shallow ground which is sliding off the rocks, and if you go to other areas, you find, infinite ground.
Yeah. On the first point, this is kind of new thinking, so I haven't had much chance to present it to anybody yet. But I was talking about something rather similar, actually, in Paris, in a workshop that was devoted specifically to writing and the book. And there happened to be a geoscientist present. And he came up in great excitement and said, because I did put up a picture a bit like this one here. And he was delighted by it. And he said, that's exactly what we've been trying to say in his field of geomorphology. And he then proceeded to explain to me at great length how geologists think about the Earth sort of coming up, and in particular how they want to think in terms of an intermediate zone, rather than saying, there's the atmosphere, which is discussed by meteorologists and climatologists, and there's the Earth that is discussed by geologists and so on. That there's actually a place in between where both fields need to come together, because you can't actually say, is it one or the other. And when you think about it, it's logical. If you think about all the emanations that from the Earth, from the soil, from rock, that affect atmospheric conditions, and when you think vice versa, how the atmosphere percolates into what we think of the Earth. The idea that they could be separated is kind of absurd, but that's the way in which boundaries have traditionally been drawn in the sciences. And in some of these present discussions about the Anthropocene, I think whatever you think about the Anthropocene as a concept, one of the positive things that's coming about is that a lot of these boundaries are breaking down. On the second point, I've just lost it a moment. So just say again what it was. It was something to do with the thickness. Oh yes, now I remember what you said exactly. Sorry, momentary glitch. If one imagine, say, something like a scree on a mountainside, where continually through the action of frost and freezing, rocks are cracking and are falling, and you've got this very unstable surface. The interesting thing is that you can't actually say, looking at that kind of surface, where does the ground begin? I mean, we did the same thing. I did this with my students on Aberdeen Beach, where at high tide it's a shingle beach, sand further down. And so we stood on the shingle and said, right, where's the ground? And, well, we've got all these pebbles. They must be sitting on the ground, mustn't they? So we pick out some of the pebbles, and what do we find? More pebbles. And then we think, well, if we keep on picking up all these pebbles, maybe we'll get to the ground. But then we began to realize that it didn't really make any sense to ask where the ground was. So to imagine that a pebble is an object on the ground, we just had to say that all this is constitutive of the ground itself. So then we have to think of the ground not as a kind of flat surface that you can put things on, but as something that is in itself. It is a surface, but it's a surface that turns out not to be a surface in a funny kind of way. It has, and that's what I've been trying to find a way of talking about this. The idea of the notion of deep surface comes from a most wonderful book by an architectural theorist called Lars Spøybroek. You may have come across it. It's called The Sympathy of Things, which is largely devoted to rethinking Ruskin's ideas about this. And there's a wonderful chapter in which Spobrook discusses the way we tend to think about ornamentation and decoration and in terms of stuff being stuck on a surface, and showing how this is actually constitutive of the surface itself, and how one could think of the surface as being formed at the place where the constitutive forces of the earth or whatever meet the erosive forces of the atmosphere. So a lot of that comes from Spobrook. Sorry. Yes.
Hi, Tim. Thanks. I found that really interesting. I was just interested if you could possibly share with us, towards the end of your lecture, you talked about erosion and burial, and if I understood you correctly, you talked about how that tended to fail, in that things tend to emanate back to the surface. What's the application? I know you say these ideas are quite new in your head at the moment, but what is the application of that? What's the use case? Were you talking metaphorically or practical? Because I can think of applications in terms of history or politics and human development.
I think potentially, I think it has very considerable application for the way we think about, particularly the way we think about the past, that it gives us an alternative, or I would hope, that it might give us an alternative discourse to the dominant heritage discourse. And the dominant heritage discourse, even as it celebrates the past, separates it from us. So it says that was then, that was our heritage. This is now. We'll put up a park or something that will celebrate this. But the past was then, the present is now. And I think it's very, very deeply sedimented in our ways of thinking about heritage, about urban planning, and the politics of that, is very heavily influenced by what I call a stratigraphic view. I think it is. And that actually, at the moment, I think, is leading us to lose the past and a sense of the past in the present at an unprecedented rate. I mean, that nowadays, particularly with digital technology, we're supposed to be archiving everything. And what archivists tell me is that we're actually losing things more quickly now than ever in the past, because these digital forms of storage are not stable. They don't have long life cycles. So our attempt to deal with the past by putting it beneath us and archiving it for posterity is not really working, and perhaps then we should develop a different way of thinking about the past that would allow us to, so to speak, roll it up, to think of the relationship between the past and the present in a more cyclical way. I haven't thought this through, but it seems to me that there's possibilities there for an alternative discourse to the heritage one. Okay. There's one down here and one up there. So we do this one first, whilst the other one.
Oh, hello. I was just thinking about it in terms of like the motion of like turning in production, and the fact like, you know, when you turn something on a lathe or you turn a part, and how like intrinsic that motion is to like the making of things, and how it's still building up. Like even additive manufacturing is a kind of stamping, and I was just thinking more in terms of like how, like even with advanced technology, it's still a mimicking of nature, and just what your thought is on that in terms of like turning, because if you think like that, you know, the solar system is an act of turning, and all this like, it all sort of
this is a really, really interesting question. So, because you're right that the movement of the whirl or the turn or the vortex is very fundamental to the way living things are constituted, to the way the world works, the way the universe moves, and the rest of it. But the Industrial Revolution, where, there's that famous article by Lynn White saying the Industrial Revolution began with the invention of the crank. The crank, which is a little bit of device that turns a reciprocal back and forth movement into a rotating movement. And simply on your bike, your feet are actually going up and down, but through the pedals, which operate as a crank, it's turned into a rotating movement of the wheel, and that all industry began there because life forms are not naturally given to circular motion. They are to vorticial motion, but not to circular motion. And I have been thinking a bit about the difference between that sort of whirl and the strict cyclical rotation of a machine. And they are different. I think perhaps in the way, for example, if you go back to old-fashioned clockwork-driven watches or clocks, if it was spring-loaded, you've got cogs which are turning mechanically in a strictly circular movement, but then you've got the coiled spring, which is actually driving it, and it's driving it because of tensile forces that are built into the material of which the string is made, so it's quite different from a cog. So both a circular movement in a sense, but the cogwheel is quite different from the spring, and there's something vital about the spring that you don't find in the cogwheel itself. And you could say that a lot of what happened in industrialization was a kind of domestication of that vitality of the cyclicity of nature. It's a really interesting question, though, distinguishing these two. Michel Serres has something to say about it in The Birth of Physics, where he's going on a lot about spinning tops and things like that. There was one.
Shall I
Yes,
ask my question sort of relates a little bit to the answer before last, but also to the answer that you've just given. When you invoked Saussure at one point, diachronic and synchronic, when you were talking about the book, but you lots of words you haven't used, and of course, millions, but included among them is hermeneutics, and I wonder if you had anything to say about that.
Oh, I don't actually have very much to say about hermeneutics. It's always a word that's confused me. With hermeneutics, if I got it right, a great deal of emphasis rests on processes of interpretation. And I think so that one gets caught up in the hermeneutic cycle, a cycle of interpretations that yield interpretations that yield interpretations and so on. And I'm more and more thinking that although there's a sort of phenomenological aspect to hermeneutics, and I'm into phenomenology, but I also want to emphasize the presence, the sheer presence of things, and what we can learn by allowing them into our midst and paying attention to them. And I get frustrated by a tendency in the human sciences, the humanities, so to say, generally, to, faced with any phenomenon, to start to interpret it rather than to pay attention to it for what it is. And one aspect of this, which I've not gone into hermeneutics in depth, but what I have done is to try and address semiotics. And of course, Saussure just represents one side of semiotics. Then there's the semiological people who go back to Peirce, who have a quite different view of things. But I was once in a seminar in Paris where a good colleague of mine, Philippe Descola, said to me, "Tim, why are you such a semiophobe?" Semiophobe. I said, yes, that's what I am. I'm definitely a semiophobe, and I'm proud of it. And I wanted to, I've been trying to explain what it is that I really have against thinking of everything we encounter as a sign. And I figured that because a sign is always a sign for something else. The sign is present, but what it's a sign of is absent. And that's what gets me. Because I think, no, actually, when I'm looking at a cloud, it's not a sign for something else. It's a cloud, and I'm looking at it, and that's it. And I don't want to interpret everything. I want to be present to it and respond to it. As one would do music, for example, same thing. I know that's not an adequate question, but I've tried to keep hermeneutics on one side.
And thank you very much for the most interesting talk. It was fantastic. Really, really interesting. There's one thing that kept coming to me right at the very beginning of your talking, really, when you were talking about the animals came in a little bit, but what I was really interested in were the worms. I noticed that you didn't use the word of worms, because I thought, with Darwin and Worms, that book, that extraordinary book, but the whole thing about the surface, really, was to do with worms, wasn't it? Because they were the ones that travelled through.
Absolutely.
So I'm fascinated. So I'm glad you've triggered that for me to trigger it. So I can now think about it more and what worms really do. So it does make your presentation thing here really, really interesting, because I think it could go on for quite a long time, moving through the animals and through and as you were saying, the erosion and the actual physicality of it.
But worms are absolutely terrific.
Worms, I have to say worms, and then I can say goodbye now.
No, don't go. Anyway, but worms are terrific, and I was very privileged to be the supervisor of a student who's now finished his doctorate, Germain Molemas, who actually he did a kind of ethnography of soil scientists in and around Paris, and particularly those people who are working on how to reconstruct urban soils, and many of which are completely barren at the moment, and worms, and the role that worms play in actually creating a living soil was absolutely fundamental to that.
But apparently you couldn't, without worms, you wouldn't be able to create the land to make anything.
That's right.
It would be your surface.
It would be barren, and so I mean there are people, according to Germain, there are people in laboratories who are trying to think how can we create an urban soil, and they said, but simply bringing together various inorganic ingredients and mixing them together doesn't do anything, because what the worms do is, I can't remember the technicalities of it, but anyway they're ingesting and digesting and redigesting, and they have all sorts of glands that produce sticky stuff that causes the particles to aggregate together in particular forms, and that's what does it. But Germain's conclusion was that we shouldn't really be talking about worms, but about worming, as every worm is an activity, a kind of a going on in the soil that is continually constituting it.
Thank you. Thank you so much for that. It was beautiful. Especially the drawing, there's a cross-section of a line. I was really taken by that. And just because you mentioned interpretation, I am curious to know what art, or how art informs what you are doing. Here we are, standing on the art school. And I have a bit of a worry that all of us just go on and interpret or over-interpret what you just said.
Okay, yeah, yes, I have been working on the interface between anthropology and art, and all of that has been driven by a concern to treat art as a discipline of inquiry on a par with anthropology. Both are concerned with inquiring into the conditions and possibilities of human life in an environment, in a world, I think. And they can learn from one another on that level. In the history of my own discipline of anthropology, unfortunately, an ethnographic approach has been predominant, in which art is treated as the productions of people that we can then study and analyze. So instead of thinking about anthropology and art, we've had a massive anthropology of art. The anthropologist comes along and says, just as though, here's a kinship system, we can analyze that. Here's a system of ritual, we can analyze here. Oh, here's some art, let's analyze it. And that's intensely boring. I mean, it gets us nowhere. So I think that where we can come together is to think of art as a form of inquiry, and again, it comes to the same thing I said in answer to your question here, that our job is not actually to interpret the art, to sort of set ourselves up on a pedestal as having some special expertise to explain to everybody else what it means. That's ridiculous, I think, and politically somewhat abhorrent. But what our job is, I think, is, and I've used the word, is to correspond with it. I've been developing this idea of correspondence, not in the sense of matching one thing to another, but in the sense of answering to, co-responding. I mean, as in a conversation, you've got two people, they're having a conversation, and each is responding to the other. Or in a string quartet, you've got the violin and the cello and whatever, and they're all answering to one another, and that process is carrying on. So that it seems to me that art is, to my mind, a certain way of corresponding with the world, of answering to it. And we, in turn, answer to the art. And I would like to think of anthropology, my own discipline, joining art in that way. But to do that, we have to stop thinking of art as objects to be interpreted, and stop thinking of ourselves as master interpreters. And in other words, stop pretending to be art critics. You know, we can do without them, I think. I don't really see what they're contributing to anything.
I have a question, if I may. You've developed this, it's not quite a cosmology, it's smaller scale, it's about the Earth, from these three immediacies, the ground, the air, and
people
scrabbly beings that run around. And you've arrived at, and towards the end you arrived at this point which talked about turning and this movement of churning. And I just wonder what space there is within this understanding for the sea, which of course is about movement and also asks questions of our understanding, whether we understand the earth and the fluidity in the earth and the fluidity in our own lives as well. What space is there for the sea within this?
That's a wonderful question, and I think the sea, as one philosopher said, it's called Dylan, I forget his first name, he said, the sea can teach us a lot about the land. Because, of course, as you know, the sea, there are rotational currents that bring water up from the depths and other water going down, and they're really crucial for the Gulf Stream, for example, that the Gulf Stream would break down if it weren't for those thermal currents in the ocean. The ocean itself is sloshing around like lots of water in a bucket, and that creates the tides. I've had a bit of an argument about this, which is critical of the idea of seascape. The trouble is that, and archaeologists do this quite a lot, that their focus is primarily on the landscape, and they're focusing on its forms, on its surfaces and everything else, and then they look towards the sea and they say, okay, there's a seascape. And as though you could kind of talk about it in the same terms. But of course it isn't like that at all, because it's not, the surface is, as you say, continually churning over, the waves, there's this movement going on all the time. So I think we should think about the sea as something quite different, but then from the perspective of the sea, you could look back on the land and say, what if we thought of the land as being something like the sea, instead of thought of the sea as being something like the land? Then you would suddenly notice that the land isn't this kind of clear-cut, sculpted surface on which everything stands, but it's just as unstable, just as churning over as the sea is. So it would give us a new perspective on it. We'd begin to see it as being much more fluid or flux-like than it is. And I think, so the ocean has a lot to teach us, I think. You're right. There's one up there too, but this,
Well, thank you for mentioning data, art, and burial, and not going into forensic science that we seem to be obsessed with. And this forensic turn is something that I want to continue with. Because in memory studies fields, a lot of scholars are writing about how landscape and the churning of the ground reveals the victim, especially in the cases of mass atrocity, and
yes.
how the landscape actually tells the story better than the people themselves. So in relation to that, I would like to know what is your opinion on Anthropocene that we all seem to apply for funding in order to even have anything published. So what is your view of that?
Of
Anthropocene.
Of the Anthropocene.
Yes.
So there's a general question, what's my view of the Anthropocene, a more specific question about what's happening in memory studies. But I feel a bit ambivalent about the Anthropocene. I think watching scientists trying to discover in their committees and their surveys whether the Anthropocene is objectively a new era or not is kind of bizarre. I mean, it's extraordinary and makes very little sense. So we can forget about that. Clearly, the concept has been hugely powerful as a kind of recruiter for all sorts of ideas. We know it's a deeply flawed concept insofar as it attributes to anthropos, to a generalized humanity, effects on the planet for which only a very small part of humanity is in any sense responsible. The massive industrial pollution, and everything goes with it, has not been driven by or the destruction of the burning of forests and so on has been driven by the demands of global capitalism. It's not been driven by all humans. So it's a very misleading concept from that point of view. But on the positive side, it has generated conversations across the science-humanities divide that had not been happening before. It's had, for example, geologists and sociologists talking together about things that they would never have conceived of before. It's broken down the old assumptions that geological processes are very long-term and slow, and social and economic processes are short-term and fast, and therefore they don't meet. So in a general shaking up of things, of intellectual terrains, I think it's been useful. But beyond that, I'm kind of skeptical. For example, what is often presented as some kind of new phenomenon, so in the current day and age, we can't separate out geological processes from social ones. It's never been the case. You never could. I mean, you could go back to prehistory, and again, you should never be able to actually separate these things out. So what modernity or globalization or whatever it is, what this has done has simply brought to awareness what we should have been aware of anyway for ages. That's my feeling about the Anthropocene. In terms of memory, or sort of sense of time more generally, there's something that worries me a lot, and it worries me. I'm worried for the generation, your generation, or generation of my grandchildren, that they're in a situation in which, because of the mass of data and information technology, the past is pushing up more than ever before, but the future is pressing down on them. They're being told, people are being told all the time that this future is not nice and it's coming at us fast. It's like imagining that the future is an express train that's running in the opposite direction to us and is about to collide. And at the same time, the train we're on is running so fast that we can't stop it. And there's a real sense of young people, if I can use that a patronizing term, young people being squeezed in the middle of experiencing something like an impending car crash. And I think that's one reason why so many young people are feeling extremely anxious and depressed. It's our fault. There are things we should do about it, I think, but that, I think, is a situation that we've not experienced before, and it concerns me a lot. Yeah,
Hi. Yeah, hello. Thanks for a great lecture. I really enjoyed that this afternoon. I'm an archaeologist, and I think you're absolutely right in the way that you're talking about this, churn of the ground over time, with things rising up as well as being inscribed downwards, and erosion working as well. And I think you're also right about heritage discourse and how there's this cut-off between the past and the present, and the two are seen to be separate things, and that's a problem. And I think we do try hard as archaeologists, as part of the processes that we use to try and record that churn as part of what we do. We create what we would call a stratigraphic matrix in order to record those processes, but they perhaps don't deal with persistence so well. And I was wondering why it is you think that if we're looking at that in archaeology, but it's not making its way into that heritage discourse, why?
That's a good question, because actually when I was discussing this with my archaeological colleagues, people like Matt Edgeworth and so on, for whom I have a profound, and Jeff Bailey, I have a profound respect for them, and they ticked me off, and they said, look, that's all very well, but in archaeology we know perfectly well, that strata don't neatly lie on top of them. Although we spend a lot of time doing exactly what you said, working out exactly how things get in what order they get mixed up. So, for example, this is Leslie McFadden's wonderful work on henge monuments in parts of Britain, where she's showing how if you have an earthwork, and when it was originally constructed, people would have been using barrows, digging soil out and depositing it, so that there is a process in the construction of a henge in which soil is dug out and tipped onto the bank to create a wall, and that is itself a turning over. And then when you excavate and you can try and distinguish the different soil layers, you can see this turning going on. So they say we never have thought in such simple stratigraphic terms, and that's not what we mean by the palimpsest. Which I say, well, that's absolutely right, but let's go back to where the term palimpsest originally came from, which is from paleography, and go back to the original coinage of the term by Osbert, somebody or other, in the 1950s, spoke precisely in these terms. He said, the land of England, it was a bit nationalistic, is like a palimpsest, there's been written on and eroded over and over again. He talked about it in those kinds of layers. So I think the only point is that it's not really a critique of archaeologists, but a critique of stratigraphic thinking, which many archaeologists would be equally critical of themselves, but we have to address the sort of hidden assumptions that lie behind it. So I don't want to be unfair on archaeologists. No, you're quite right. No. There was over there, I think you had a... Oh, sorry. Well, one, two.
Yeah,
oh,
just
sorry.
Thanks again. Everyone's very impressed, and it was a great lecture. And some great phrases like interpenetration, and we haven't touched on a bit, I think, hovering around the room, the way in which the balances will alter between atmosphere, ground, earth, particularly given that the climate change reality that we're rushing towards already in fact. Have you started that discussion with that sector, with the climatologists, about your model?
No, because I haven't. I've only just thought of it. but there's a discussion to be had. in anthropology, I mean, speaking for my discipline, we have a particular problem with the whole climate change issue because it has become so polarized. Because the dominant climate change discourse is global in the way it talks about things. It rides over local concerns, local people, any kind of forms of care for the environment, by saying, here is the situation for the globe. And it claims authority on the basis of big science and scientific expertise, riding over any forms of local knowledge, community involvement, and so on. And naturally, anthropologists want to be critical of that. They want to be critical of the science, of the politics behind the science, of the power dynamics that drive it, and of course the financial incentives that drive it, without appearing to be climate change deniers. And the difficulty that we're in at the moment is that you can't criticize climate change discourse, which is highly political, highly linked to corporate global interests and so on, without appearing to deny the science. And we don't want to do that. So I'm not sure, I mean, that's the problem in anthropology. There's a great deal of angst about it. You know, how do we position ourselves as critics of the discourse without appearing to deny it and have any traction in the larger world? That's the problem for us. The problem for me then is to see how I might link that to the way I'm thinking about the ground. And I think that link is there, and it lies in unpacking a contradiction that exists at the moment between thinking of the Earth as the ground we stand on and thinking of the Earth as the planet. And at the moment, there's a sort of disjunction between the two, so that we can think about one without, or what we're doing to one without dreaming about the other. And the problem is how to link those two together. That's a big problem. I'm not sure how to tackle it. Yeah, there's one lady just behind you. You got the microphone. Yes.
Yeah. As a PhD student, specifically looking at issues of sustainability at the local level and local behaviours, that was a very really enjoyed you speaking just then. My question was, thinking about the things that you've been talking about today, for people who are engaged in research in one way or another and thinking about sharing their ideas in quite linear forms like papers, do you have, but who are looking at issues which are so varied and mixing and about these gradients and like things to do with like behaviors that happen in local social systems. Do you have any thoughts on how is what are some of the better ways to share ideas and share what you find in ways which are less linear, I suppose, less or
it's a big problem, and I think there's something very seriously wrong with academic publishing at the moment, in that it's become desiccated, really, and also driven, particularly in the sciences. I mean, there are these big publishers, Elsevier and so on, who are just making millions of pounds of profit on the back of all this stuff. But the degree to which, it's appalling, the degree to which the writing of research reports has become standardized to a particular model, the extent to which our own voices, the voices of the authors of these papers, have been eradicated. And I think in the name of the objective dissemination of research findings. And I think that this disconnect between you as a person who's doing research and what you produce in the form of research output is very, very damaging. And I think one of the reasons why we need to bring the arts in is to try and introduce some sort of correction to that. And somehow we need to get it across that an author speaking personally on the basis of their considered experience is not somehow an inferior form of knowledge to one that rules that out. So I think what has happened is that knowledge has become commodified within the overall scope of a global knowledge economy, and it's the commodification of knowledge that has then created this kind of situation, and you know, young scholars are forced into it by the ref, by all this kind of thing, when they're supposed to publish, write and publish in certain kinds of ways, which I think are objectionable. But if we could just, it can't be right that there are two kinds of literature. There's one that's sort of research literature and the other that's called poetry, you know, and they're not supposed to touch one another. And that can't be right. And it must be possible to find ways of communicating what we know in ways that actually are infused with some sense of engagement, of feeling with what we're talking about. And in that sense, to create a more inclusive, actually more democratic conversation. But how we change that, God only knows. It's really hard. There's one, yes, please.
Thank you for this lecture. And I have a question. Where do you locate humans in this diagram? Because for me, in a certain way, I'm thinking that we are not on the ground, but we are the ground together with other creators. Yeah.
We're in there.
And what we can do to keep the earth open and this relation between the two.
Absolutely. We're definitely in it, not on it.
Yeah.
And interestingly, you often get that idea from, in anthropology, we're talking a lot to so-called indigenous people. And if you talk to people who are, say, from my own field, people who, I've worked with Sami people in Lapland, but people who've worked amongst NA people in northern North America, and they talk a lot about the land and about the importance of the land and what it means to go out on the land and do things on the land. And then you ask, what is this thing, the land, that they're talking about? And it turns out to be a volume. It's not, and that's one of the reasons why there were so many misunderstandings historically between indigenous people and government officials, administrators. The administrators always thought that when people were talking about the land, they meant something they could draw on a map, sort of cartographically. So there's this surface, you know, that could be mapped and the territory. But when indigenous people were talking about the land and saying we belong to the land, that land included the earth and the sky. It wasn't a separation. The idea of separating the two was completely unthinkable and made no sense at all. So when you spoke about the land, you meant the whole thing. And if you're out on the land, you're out in the weather, you're out on the earth, I mean, you're in the water, you're out on the lake or whatever it is, but everything is in there. So you can't actually, it's impossible to be on the land, literally. You can only be in it.
Thank you.
And I think, yes, we could learn from that. Okay. I think it's time to stop. Yeah.
Well, that was not the less, because he's so brilliant at thinking on his feet and you know, talking from his feet. So I think that's all we can do.